So
Yeah.
let's people who are joining the Liz, this is so that we can get access to the presentation and interact with it, right? What's on
Correct.
the screen?
Yeah, absolutely. So using your smartphones, use the QR code or go to menti.com and enter the code that's on the screen. You do not have to sign up. You do not have to create an account. You don't even have to enter your name. It is all anonymous, aggregated engagement opportunities. So throughout today's water cooler chat, I'll be asking all kinds of fun questions. And so that's the way you'll be able to participate in the conversation. Of course, as always, Marianne is going to be monitoring the chat on Zoom. And anyone who raises their hand and wants to verbally speak as opposed to typing, all are welcome to do that as well.
Thanks. We'll repeat that once more at noon when I introduce you.
Sounds good.
I don't have a biography, so you're just going to have to put up with what I'm going to say about you.
That's okay.
Okay.
And as well, the code and the website is on every slide. So if you, for whatever reason, jump out of it and you're like, how do I get back in? Fear not. It's not like a one and done in terms of the code and the website.
Okay, I have 3 minutes to finish my piece of fruit. So I'll come back. Greg is here. Greg, you want to pop in and say hi?
Sure. Hello. Hi, how are you? Lost my video. How are you doing, Liz?
I'm doing well. How are you? I understand you're out on the West Coast, so this is a morning session for you.
Believe it or not, this is my first session after moving back to the East. I'm not on the East Coast, but I'm in Louisville, Kentucky, which is in the Eastern time zone now.
Nice. So you are joining us for a lunch hour water cooler.
Yes, that's unusual because there have been times when I've woken up and realized, oh, I'm doing a water cooler chat in like 30 minutes. I better get moving here. Usually I'm awake before then, but yeah, so this is my new apartment. I had a great welcome to Louisville. That my car was stolen a week and a half after I moved into my apartment. But fortunately, I had a tracker on it, and we found it right away.
Nice.
Yeah, the thief even filled up the gas tank for me, which was really nice of them. So
maybe they were just borrowing the car.
yes, they took it
It's
on a
the
nice little
Louisville
joyride.
version of the welcome wagon.
Yeah, they took it on a nice little joyride. They had cigarette ashes in there, a full bottle of Jack Daniel's lemonade, and a shot glass. So yeah, they had a pretty good time in the car. And like I said, they filled up the tank for me, which was really nice of them. So, but yeah, it's gone well here. So yeah, we've Cats and I have settled in, and so my continuing tour of the country, as Marianne said, don't you stay anywhere for more than a year? So, yeah, so I'm looking forward to your presentation today. Yes.
There's going to be lots of interaction. So
Good. I see Ruthie's here now too.
Yep, I am.
Okay, I've got 12 o'clock. The Virgo in me loves to reward people for being on time. Welcome everyone to our water cooler chats. We started this during COVID because we were all lonely for each other's company. We stopped at for a while when we ran out of topics, and people actually stopped me and sent me emails and stuff and said, man, you broke my heart. So we brought them back, but now we're doing them once a month. This month, we actually, let me introduce the Stop Hell team. I'm sorry, I'm Marianne Pelletier, and we'll go by seniority.
I'm Greg Duke.
And I'm Ruthie Giles.
And so we're your friendly hosts for the session, and we'll be responsible for making sure your questions get heard, but we'll also be responsible for asking questions when Liz wonders if anybody's listening. I want to introduce Liz Rejman what is your new company's name? I'm sorry.
It's okay. It's Liz Rejman Co. And that's the website as well, is literally my name, lizrejman.co.
Thank you. And Rejman is R-E-J-M-A-N.
Yes.
Yep. So Liz and I we've been old buddies for years, and we both served on the APRA board, but Liz was so good at it, she got to be the president. I have always relied on her for practical and clear advice, and spending time with her is never dull. She's full of ideas, she's full of observations, and she has leadership skills that have helped me a lot in my career. And I did not bother to go get your biography, so they're just going to have to deal with how I see you.
Well, that's a beautiful way of seeing me, Marianne. Thank you. Like
You're welcome.
all the time. Thank you for inviting me to the water cooler chat today. I'm gonna dive right in. If you want to see my bio, feel free to hop onto LinkedIn and connect in with me. But I'm sure all of you folks want to get into the good juicy parts around data lifecycle and practical ways to optimize your data to support your fundraising strategy. So let's talk about that and not about me. I invite and encourage everyone to either scan the QR code or go to menti.com, enter the code that is on the screen. There are some interactive questions and polls, and so that's a great way to engage with and have a dialogue today during the water cooler. Of course, you are more than welcome to also comment or ask questions in the chat. Put up your hand. Marianne is monitoring the chat and the hand raising. And Marianne, please, interrupt me whenever there is a question or like a really smart comment or sassy comment, whatever the case might be. And we'll keep going forward. So with that in mind, the whole session for today is on optimizing strategic decisions by maximizing your data's potential. Very sounds very formal and serious business. I'm going to try and lighten it a little bit because we're at a water cooler. We're chit-chatting with each other, and I invite everyone to take this time and take this opportunity to think about your data, to think about your donor data, to not worry about the dings and the notifications and the emails and the project that's due, but to really kind of focus and use this time to work through what is possible and how to optimize your data in order to make great fundraising strategic decisions. So we can all think of ourselves sitting here at the virtual office, enjoying a snack or some water. The first question I would love to ask all of you is, when you think of your donor data, what is one word that comes to mind? And so disaster, vast, vital, beautiful, inconsistent, Excel. So that's an interesting one. Is it like Microsoft Excel, or is it like we excel at data? A gold mine. Love that. Evolving. It's always fun when these words are spinning around. So thank you for that. It's a clearly a range of emotions when it comes to our donor data for sure. And hopefully at the end of the session today, for those who are feeling like it's a disaster and messy, that they might have a few tips and tricks to get it one step closer to the gold mine that it can be. So with that in mind, my second question to all of you is, do you trust your donor data? Nice. Well, this is interesting.
We have somebody chiming in with a sometimes.
I can appreciate that. Yes, this is a very binary question here, yes or no, but sometimes I think is also an accurate reflection. I think this is very heartening to see this, because I have often heard, and this is typically from frontline fundraisers, is the answer like, I don't trust the data. I don't, because of that messiness, because it's a disaster, I can't trust it, which means I'm always sort of second guessing any of the outputs, the results, the insights. So this is a trusting group. That's fantastic. This is something that I think is, it's a quote that I'm going to attribute to myself. But it's obviously would have come from some sort of insights here, there, and everywhere. But I think, one of the things that challenges us with data and why it can feel like it's a mess and a disaster and overwhelming is that there isn't necessarily the strategic oversight of data that it deserves in order for it to contribute to our fundraising success in our organizations. And this is what this data lifecycle and this conceptualization that I have around data lifecycle hopefully will help you think about data and the need for it to have strategic oversight. So the data lifecycle, it's a phrase that I'm challenged with. Like, I never could grasp like what does this mean? What are we talking about here? And I'm a data person. I'm a data aficionado, enthusiast for sure. When you break it down into this sort of like this cycle, it's the idea that you create data, you manage it, you use it, and then you eventually delete it. And then, you continue that cycle on with various data points. But still, despite that fact, I struggled with this concept of life cycle. Basically, I didn't like the terminology. So this is where I kind of flipped it. And I thought about, what if you thought of data like an employee? How would that then change your perspective around how you manage it, how you work with it, when you onboard it, when you offboard it, when it comes into the organization, when it leaves the organization, how does it perform? How are you maximizing its potential? And so with that, the idea of a data lifecycle management, and this is a very high level definition, it really is referring to all those sort of policies, tools, the training that helps dictate that data lifecycle. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Yes, Marianne, I saw your hand up.
Thanks. So this is what's triggering me, right? And actually, Elizabeth Rich is asking the next question is, does data ever get deleted, right? And so the minute we say life cycle, we're saying that there's a death.
Yes. And so this is why I don't like life cycle as a terminology. I like it as a concept of an employee. So great question. I'm going to ask that to put a hold on the question, because we're going to go through that. And that is actually one of the questions I'm going to be asking folks when we get to that point is like, do we ever delete data? And if we do, when? So maybe you saw my slides in advance, who knows? So yeah, I like to think of it, and I appreciate, Marianne, your comment, like it was triggering because then it's this idea that it's death. but we know for a fact that there is donor data that like we use and it has longevity. But there is also data that, we use for a very short period of time. Maybe it's on a contract with us. There's some data that, it comes and goes over the years and is no longer relevant. Maybe the role or the job is no longer works with the needs of the organization. So this is my one and only homage to Star Trek. I'm not necessarily a big Trekkie, but I mean, I had to put in data to think about data as your indispensable coworker, for sure. So when we think about that as data as like a coworker, and when you're thinking about when you need to create a new role, what is the one thing you want to always create? It's a job description, right? You want to be articulating what are the roles and responsibilities, who's managing the new role, who will the role manage, what is their level of authority or seniority in the organization. And so flipping it from like a life cycle to data as an employee, those job descriptions in that case would be things like your organizational data strategy, your governance policy, your data classification tables, identifying and documenting who might be the data owners, stewards, or users. Or in this case, as an employee, is it like senior leadership, manager, director, coworkers? And so definitely having those pieces documented in order to understand how are you using the data, why are you using it, what is its role in the success of your fundraising. So with that in mind, I would love to hear from folks, do you have an up-to-date data governance policy? The question mark is in the wrong spot, but no worries.
Maybe it was a Freudian slip.
Maybe it was a Freudian slip.
Monica says no.
All righty.
So it's 10 for no.
So interestingly, the majority are either no, not yet, or it's in progress. And I think there's no judgment here. But what I think is telling is, again, that kind of speaks to where do we see the importance of data and how can we ensure that it's living up to its potential? How are we maximizing its potential? Well, if we don't have an understanding of how we're going to govern it, how we're going to be using it, in what context, how is it going to be interacting with the organization and with each department? If we're not clear on that, how can it perform to its maximum potential? So I would definitely encourage folks to think about starting up a data governance policy, writing one up. Marianne, what is your experience with data governance policies?
So the clients that we work with know that they need to have one. There is so you know how frank I am. Usually the question is, who's the poor soul who has to wrangle all the people and get them to agree?
Right.
Yep. And so sometimes it's even like, we're going to hire somebody and give that person this charge. But data governance also is usually pushed harder from the IT perspective because they're responsible for PCI compliance and what have you. So that sometimes is a gateway. John's saying, he's been advocating it for 7 years. That sometimes is the gateway drug to getting a data governance policy in your shop.
For sure, for sure. So my comment on this is, maybe the tiny gain, and I'm a big believer in tiny gains, is like, what's like the one small step you can do to get forward momentum is maybe it's not an organizational data governance policy. Maybe it's a donor data governance policy. And so instead of waiting for the entire organization to come on board, putting something forward together as it relates only specifically to your donor data. Right.
Ruthie is chiming in that she was told not to bring up the expression data governance policy because apparently there had been a war on about it before. So it was a touch point.
So that is a great point, Ruthie. And that again, like I think, to my point and to Mary Ann's point, why I don't really like the concept of a donor life cycle. I like the idea of conceptualizing data as a fellow employee that's working alongside of you. Yeah, what is the alternative to data governance? Because governance also is a loaded word, right? Like it can have a lot of gravitas associated with it. And,
Yeah, you need permission to use the data, touch to the data, talk to the data. People you
exactly.
need permission from are always out for today.
Yes. And it can also create, instead of having maybe like guardrails, it creates, I know, barbed wire fences in terms of, so like, what's the, what's the alternative wording, but still getting to the point of having a data governance policy? I invite folks to think about that. No answers are required at this moment in time. So this question I would love to hear. So do you know the role? So the role being, is it clear in your organization who is the data owner? So that is the person that is accountable and responsible for your data, for the accuracy, for the consistency, for the data architecture, the development of the coding. Sometimes they may be in charge of the security in terms of who are the users. A data steward. So a data steward is someone who supports a data owner. They may be the ones who help with updating the data, deduping the data, highlighting where there are inconsistencies, supporting in inputting data into your database. And then there's the data users, those folks who would not be responsible for the actual updating or cleansing of the data, but they would be responsible for mentioning it, highlighting it, or talking, or being the ones who are actually using it. So they're consuming the reports. Maybe they're going into the CRM in order to look up information. And, so I'm thinking oftentimes data users are your frontline fundraisers. A data steward may be a coordinator or an assistant or a manager. And then a data owner may be like the database manager or the director of advancement operations. So in your shop, is it clear who has those roles?
So Ellen chimes in and says, we're making it happen by being the first team to switch over to a multi-year enterprise level CRM.
Oof.
It makes sense for us to lead the process since we'll be using the new system first. Ellen, I've done that. And yeah, you get to decide how to manage primary address and delivery address and stuff.
For sure. When I was employed at Pathways to Education Canada, our team, the fundraising team, ended up usually being the trailblazers, because it was oftentimes the organization understood the value but wasn't quite ready yet to move forward. And so we became trailblazers, guinea pigs, beta testers, whatever word you want to use, and ended up being the ones that would like create the processes, understand where the pitfalls might be, but also understand like what are the great possibilities. So there's some great excitement in that, in terms of autonomy. It is also, it can also be a little scary too, right? You don't know what's ahead of you on the road. So this is great to know, though, that most folks have good clarity on what roles exist. I think this is really helpful, though, as well. And it's one thing I would also encourage in terms of documenting, and that could be part of that data governance policy, is documenting what roles are the data owner, the data steward, the data user, in order to understand how that relationship works with the data. So there's good clarity. So because one of the inefficiencies you can find is you have folks who is not in the best use of their time trying to update the data, when in fact you have someone who may be a subject matter expert and can do it really quickly because they know what fields to include or not include or add, or what the drop down table is and what the different definitions are. So having that good clarity and sharing it across the organization is incredibly important to help again, your coworker data know how to reach its full potential and be as efficient as it possibly can. So when we think about acquiring, bringing on a new staff member, so we've got that job description. Now we got to go out and look. We got to do some recruitment and selection, right? We got to decide, this is the whole like posting the job, the interview process, the interview questions, all that kind of fun stuff. So when you think about that in parallel with data, this is where things like a data collection policy comes into play. Thinking about, is this internal data that you're going to be gathering independently? Is this, you're going to be out acquiring data from external sources that it's going to be coming to you? And with those things, you want to be thinking about like the ethical and legal considerations, as well as, what vendors are you using? And what is your vendor due diligence policy in the context of that collection of data? I think one of the hot topics these days is really around the collection of DEI data, right? Data that identifies individuals from potentially radicalized communities, BIPOC, 2S LGBTQ2+. What does your data collection policy say around, those various pieces of data? Thinking also about from a prospect development perspective, wealth screening and all of the different data points related to that. What are you collecting? How are you collecting it? What are you not collecting it? And so I would love to hear from the folks, like what data collection questions do you currently wrestle with? So you can post the question right here in through Mentimeter or through chat, or, we can hear your wonderful voice as opposed to mine and Marianne's.
While you're waiting, Larissa shared a quote. Data governance is best defined as managing data with guidance.
Managing data with
guidance.
Nice. So maybe it's a data guidance policy. Maybe it's a data code of conduct. I don't know. If we keep I'm trying to pull this whole employee analogy, right? All employees have a code of conduct that they usually tend to be required to sign these days.
Yeah.
It's the same with the data, though the data literally won't be signing it, of course.
Right.
Alrighty. How do we apply best practices to data governance with having a lot of control over how the data is being input? That's a very good question.
It's not your doing, but it's your fault. That never happens in nonprofits.
Exactly. But I think this also happens though, in terms of sometimes you don't have control over how the data is being input, because the reality these days, especially when we're thinking about donations, they're coming in through so many different sources, right? Your online donation form, through Benevity, through, United Ways, through Facebook giving campaigns, through third-party P2P fundraisers. And so you're right, you don't necessarily have a lot of control maybe on the required data fields. You might not have control in terms of how people have inputted the data. So in terms of that best practice, I think that's where two things are at play. As there, you'll have to understand what are your must-haves, like what are the non-negotiables in terms of data governance, and then what are the best practices, preferred state, but if it doesn't happen, it's not going to be the end of the world. Marianne, do you or anyone else on the call have any thoughts?
So yes. Whoops, people are getting excited now.
Oh, good.
Michelle says, especially in our CRM, like a Blackbaud product, there's no audit trail. So we don't know, we don't have a trail to follow up. Greg responded, there is an audit trail module, but it's expensive. Emily said, is there a good source or process recommended for data on current employment that doesn't involve mailing surveys and calls? Oh, all her fundraisers want that magic bullet that says, where do they work right now?
Yeah.
I don't know how to give it to them without taking all of my time on other, or the time of other data updaters. I hear you, Emily. I hear you. I
That's
actually work,
some respect research training for the fundraisers on how to use LinkedIn, perhaps, or use another paid database that can provide that information.
yeah. So she uses LinkedIn and Sales Navigator, but it does not take time. It does take time to get the stuff updated.
Yeah. Yeah, because
Yeah,
LinkedIn,
because LinkedIn, they're very jealous over their data. They'll sue you if you use it.
and is that so that's also one of those like ethical and legal considerations around terms of service and how you navigate that and how your organization interprets it as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
For sure. I'm just going to, I've never used this. Here we go. Here's a second question. Around data collection, use and storage of contact information collected through research that is not provided by the donor. For example, a phone number or email, do we record it? Do we use it? So I'll give the Canadian perspective, and then Marianne or someone else can give the US perspective. So in Canada, we are governed by a number of different privacy laws. In this case, the one I'm going to cite is it's called PIPEDA, PIPEDA. And PIPEDA states that if the information is generally publicly available, and so one of the examples they cite is a business email found on a business website, it can be used. If it is private information, then the question comes into play around consent and whether it can be used or not.
Yeah, you're talking about opt-in, opt-out, right? So
not even. So in terms of you're doing your research and you're looking for, Quinn B lawyer, and Quinn's email address is on the law website, you can then use that email to reach out to them. Now, you can't use it to include it in a mass email mailing, for example, if they do not have a pre-existing relationship. So if they're an existing donor and you find their email on a publicly available site, you can send them out an email, but then if they with the ability to opt out, obviously.
right, yeah, sorry, that's where I was going. That if I acquire this happens to me in my personal life, right? So I sign up for I buy something using my personal email. And all of a sudden I get sales emails, not only to my personal email, but to my work, my business email, which I consider to be affrontive. So I would try to be very thoughtful about, and then the question is, what's the risk, right? The problem with nonprofits is that in sales, you pretend that there's another person coming along that you can catch if you take off this person. In nonprofits, it's not as easy to replace a lost donor because of the narrowness of the scope. So it's tricky either way, but I would offer a very clear opt-out if I got a hold of somebody, and I would have to start with the newsletter, just like you suggested, right? You have to get in touch with them without the solicitation first and see if they respond or if they opt out. I've had people tell me, I'm a lawyer, and I know what my rights are, so you'd better not send me this anymore,
I think, it's also, what is your existing relationship with the person, right? Like if they are a current donor, or maybe they're a board member or volunteer, that may be a different consideration than if you've identified this person because they have capacity and their giving interest seems to align with your organization, right? Like then you really have to think very carefully about two things. One is data breach, right? So what happens if there's a data breach and that data is in your database? How do you explain that to that person who has no relationship with you?
Right.
Second, to your point, Marianne, the question of like, how did you acquire this and why are you reaching out to me? Can you explain that in a way that you're not like sort of dancing on your toes? that you right? Like that you feel comfortable and
I love
confident,
that expression. Yeah.
then those are the things you want to think about and consider. I'm going to keep going because apparently there's 2 of 5 here, which is fantastic. How do you handle questionable data which you are unsure of its value, such as raw screening data in a database? I'm going to go back to my previous point is if you were to have a data breach and that data went out into the public domain, how would you feel about having to explain that to the donor? Now, in terms of some raw screening data, sometimes it can be pretty meaningless because it's like just numbers, right? Like a score. Then I would ask the question, how are you thinking about like your strategy? How are you planning on using that? Are you going to use it? And 2, can you easily define it? So in other words, if 2 or 3 years down the road, if someone was to look at it, would they know what the heck it's all about? Would they understand what it relates to, what it means? If you don't have clear definitions around it, it's going to get useless very quickly, because if you only one person or 2 people know what it relates to, then it's not meaningful. It's not going to move a relationship forward necessarily to inspire or engage a donor or an individual or a corporation to give to your organization.
Liz, this was my question, and I guess the follow-up question would be, where do we put information like this then?
It's a great question, because on the one hand, you think about like your CRM as like the single source of truth. You want to kind of have one centralized area. You don't want to have like shadow databases or data in, Excel spreadsheets everywhere. But then you also have to think about like what is its value and meaning in the database as well. So that's probably my like non-answer answer to you, Greg. And I invite others to think about that.
Yeah. And even if you put a caveat on it, so I think it was Ruthie who was like, yeah, once you have, even if policies in place and even if there's a code on it, do not share or, information only, there's still going to be a rogue gift officer who goes out there and exploits the data and calls people up, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, and that's why our database, we spend so much more money on our database services, so that there's an alert pops up. It says, don't send Marianne emails to her business address unless you're actually doing business with her.
Right. But that also goes back to that data governance policy, so that the policy is there so that there is a clear roadmap, a clear guidelines for all of the organization that is embedded in the values of the organization, and it relates to a policy, not a personal decision as well, right? So you speak to policy, not
so it's enforceable through personnel management. Stephanie writes, she is regularly solicited by her grad school alma mater and former employer, even though she has do not solicit tag on her file when she left.
Wow.
So they had a database conversion and somebody messed it up.
Or
that's me with unsubscribe every day of the week, right?
So that's an interesting point, because one of the things I've seen,
what someone said, and we actually went through this where I work now too. Someone, one of my gift officers here at Florida Tech, also had the same kind of thought. It's like, well, we need to revisit this every 3 to 5 years. We need to solicit them to see if they're still do not solicit or do not contact.
That means you send them a postcard and it says, we have you as do not solicit. Please confirm you're still feeling that way. Not, hey, we're going to step on you. How about now? Yeah, I hear you.
That would also point to, though, a data privacy policy or data retention policy. So to your point, Stephanie, I mean, I think that's a really good point, is like, so that fundraiser has made that decision around that 3 years. The policy would state in perpetuity, or, every 3 years, as Marianne highlighted, they would receive this particular type of communication. It isn't someone just making that decision, because again, the decision is inconsistent and it needs to relate to a policy. The other thing I have found is sometimes and it may or may not be the experience that you have, Stephanie, or others, is organizations, and I've seen this, like fundraisers are like, I'm going to put this do not solicit code on the record because I don't want them to be solicited through the mass market, through the direct mail, through the annual fund. I want to be the only one that communicates with them. And then the problem is you have staff turnover. And meanwhile, the person didn't say they didn't want to be solicited. It was that they didn't want to be solicited. A fundraiser made a decision that they didn't want them to be solicited in a certain way. And then that goes on there in perpetuity. And then you have, 5 years down the road, it's like, did the person really mean do not solicit, or did some rogue fundraiser put that on and forget to take it off? So that again goes back to the policy piece.
Right, because there's do not solicit per John Jones, which means John Jones couldn't get the person on the phone 3 times. So he said do not solicit.
Exactly.
But that's still, you have to ask quietly and gently, and you have to ask, may we talk to you?
Absolutely, yes.
Right. But if Stephanie, I would recommend that you file a complaint against with your state attorney general that they're, violating your right to tell them no? What is that expression? You can tell a vendor no more contact?
There exists in Canada as well, the ability to complain that they're violating your explicit wishes.
Yeah,
Also,
unsubscribe.
Stephanie, Stephanie, I think you're still in Florida, right, Stephanie?
Yes, correct.
Yeah, so the Florida Sunshine Law allows anybody to see anything you have in your in your university database. So I would definitely put that out to the consultant too.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
We're all over this, man. We're all indignant on your behalf.
Yeah, there's the particular institution that is having the issues is actually not in Florida, so unfortunately, but that is something I can bring up to my team, and they're like insisting on disregarding that in our database, like Ruthie had said upstream that I was kind of replying to about gift officers going rogue and ignoring those data tags.
Mm-hmm.
This is an amazing question. How do you go about retracting information that is no longer accurate? Do you suggest deleting it completely or adding in an additional note? I'm actually, we're going to talk about data retention so I'm going to, again, put a little pin on this one, but we are going to get back to this question because I think it's an incredibly important one. And then what are some best practices to maintain data integrity through verification balanced against the timeliness of emergency requests from our end users? How do we help them understand the importance? So I also have some conversation points around this. The only thing I will say to this, and this is me being a little bit sassy, is I don't believe that there are ever any fundraising emergencies. And if there is, that is a commentary on senior leadership's inability to plan and manage their time appropriately. But that's my sassy Liz Rejman person comment on that one. Any other comments or questions in the chat, Marianne, or any hands that are up?
You are getting a whole lot of thumbs up and yes on your comment, and so your sass is definitely being applauded.
Thank you. Yes, I always used to say that in my previous workplace as well. There are no fundraising emergencies, which means you do not work overtime and you do not work on the weekends. Those are extreme exceptions, never the norm. But that's another water cooler discussion. So there we go.
Well, yeah, that's what I said to my team too. If you work during the week, you don't have to sit here Friday night.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So going back again to this idea of like, if your data is an employee and we're thinking about the data, so we've got this job description, we have come up with sort of how are we recruiting it? How are we selecting it? What are we choosing? Where is it going? And now when you think about onboarding, like you think about yourself as a new employee, like what do you need to know? You need to know like, where am I sitting? What is my technology? So that's usually around things like data storage, that, where is the data being stored in the CRM, or to Greg's point around, do you store other data points in other places? This speaks to things like making sure it's very clearly understood around data security and privacy. So this goes to Stephanie, your comment very specifically. If you have a data privacy policy, you know, one of the things you would want to think about is this idea of if a donor wishes not to be solicited or not to be contacted, what is the organization's stance? Is that in perpetuity until a donor comes back and self-identifies and changes their mind? Is it that it will be reviewed on a specific cadence, and this is how it will be reviewed, and how will the outreach happen? You know, to Marianne's example around sending out a postcard asking for, you know, to confirmation. And then this also speaks to, you know, the data architecture. What data points are going in what field? How are they being named? What are the definitions in that context of when you're sort of onboarding data in order to be able to effectively use it in reports, in visualizations, in mailings, in terms of, you know, securing insights in order to inform fundraising strategy. So with that in mind, I'm curious to hear from folks whether you have an existing donor privacy policy in place. Keeping in mind, all of this information is anonymous. I don't know which blue dot you are, so.
This is cool.
This is cool.
This is like Facebook meets, what's that? Bubble charts.
Bubble charts. All righty. So the majority of you have said yes, which is fantastic. And then in progress is very quickly behind. And then a few folks have said no. That's okay. It's, you know, what is it? They say, you know, the best time to plant a tree is like 20 years ago. The next best time is today. A donor policy would have been great, you know, 5 years ago, 3 years ago. The next best time today.
Liz, I'm actually working with a client that we're building our donor privacy policy as we're switching over to a new database, because we're learning what their privacy is. So that, I think, is also a good time to build a donor privacy policy.
Absolutely. So that is a great observation, Greg, in terms of like good timing. So there can be, you can always think about creating some of these policies, like say on a very specific cadence, right? Like the beginning of the fiscal year, in advance of you know, the giving season, which is usually October, November, December. Or you can think about it, as Greg mentioned, you know, when something, you know, significant is happening, right? Like, so you're turning over onto a new CRM, great time to review your policies, your processes, you know, are they still serving you? Will they, you know, serve you well in the new CRM, or are they going to be clashing, and therefore, because they're clashing, nobody's going to want to be using them? So for sure. All righty. This is one of my favorite topics, which is around documentation and the importance of documenting and defining your data points. I think, you know, when we fail to do this, we end up creating situations where people interpret what certain things mean. And I've seen this time and time again. Like, I went into one organization, I started out, and they had a prospect sort of classification system. And I said to them, okay, tell me what these different words mean. And I think, I don't know, 4 out of the 5 folks, they were like, I don't exactly know what that means, so I don't use it. I just use these ones, and this is how I interpret it. So in other words, they weren't leveraging, you know, the thought and intentionality that went into creating certain data fields or data codes, because it wasn't clear what the definition was. It hadn't been documented, it hadn't been referenced, it hadn't been reviewed. So this is a very interesting point. So the majority of folks are saying they have an understanding, but no documentation. And so, I mean, understanding is one step better than having no understanding, like was in the case of my example. The challenge with that is, again, when you have staff turnover, If it isn't documented, then, you know, you're playing kind of like that tin can telephone with the information. I think the other thing you need to consider is staff will forget things. And if it's important, it's worth repeating. And one of the ways to be able to repeat that is to have it documented. I think one of the like kind of light bulb moments that I had was really around data classification. So in other words, data classification as in, is this piece of data public? Is it private internal? Is it like restricted only to select individuals? While I think most of us, especially prospect development professionals who, you know, really take the ethical use of data very seriously, have an inherent or an implicit understanding of what would be public or private or restricted or confidential. Until you actually document that, it's something that's, you know, is again, sort of, I would say folklore to some extent, not that it's inaccurate folklore, but by putting that actually to paper, to documenting it, you then again, when you go to do, say, reporting, business intelligence, data visualization, predictive modeling, suddenly now you have a guidebook. And so you can work with folks who maybe don't work in the data every day, maybe like your marketing folks or your IT or your business intelligence folks. And then you're at least having a clear understanding of what can and can be used and in what context.
I have to agree, and people are saying the definitions documented saves a lot of time. Ruthie on our team is usually, when she starts working with a client, she says, "Where is your data definition document?" Just because she doesn't want her version of gift to be their version of gift.
For sure.
Yep. And also what happens is you get new staff in and they're using the data definitions from the last job.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I've seen,
I'm sorry, Sarah, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, says documentation is important. Enforcement from the top is also important. And Lee says, any advice for getting everyday users to buy into prospect development, level appreciation, and privacy? Oh, you're getting hit with you started it, right? You're getting hit with the political questions.
So I'm gonna go with the ethics questions, like how do you get the buy-in around the ethics or the appreciation of ethics? Again, to me, this is one of my like little isms is if it's important, it's worth repeating. And so where can you inject opportunities to talk about ethics outside of when there is an ethical dilemma? Because when there is an ethical dilemma, there's a lot of, I think, emotion, there's a lot of stress, there's a lot of feelings of risk. But when you don't have that ethical immediate dilemma, then when you're talking about ethics, you're coming from a place of contemplation and probably looking at it from a much more logical or values-based perspective. So one of the things I love to do is actually have an annual ethics case study session, maybe in one of your team meetings or as part of like a learning and development training opportunity. And I literally just, you know, find some great case studies. APRA has a whole bunch of them. Feel free to reach out to me. I've got a few good doozies. And then just go through those and ask the question of the team, like, what would you do? And when you are able to hear and understand what leadership, what their perspective is, what your colleagues' perspective is, it's a great learning opportunity. And it's an opportunity, I think, to help them gain more appreciation like prospect development professionals have for ethics in terms of the use of the data. For sure. That's my one suggestion, a tiny gain, if you will. All righty, let's keep going. We're at 10:02. Wow. Whew. I'm going to zip through these things, but this is where the juicy part also comes in, which is that performance review where folks were asking about data integrity, assessments and reviews, you know, and that idea of data retention, which we will certainly get to for sure. So this is a totally, is an incredibly important question, of course, is when you're doing data integrity tasks, you know, what snack are you pairing that with? Marianne, I feel like you're going to pick something healthy.
Well, no, I'm totally all over Coffee Crisp now.
So that would be in the
You're
chocolate.
speaking. You and Coffee Crisp are forever linked in my mind.
Something salty. Oh, salty and sweet are winning out here. And I know,
Like-
like, what's the difference between chocolate and sweet? So sweet, I'm thinking like gummies,
Yeah.
you know,
Fudge.
fudge, maybe.
You know, my inner statistician wants to know what the correlation is between the salty sweet and the male female, but you know.
Well, Marianne, there could be male, female, or folks who identify as they, them. So it gets even
Right.
more complicated that way.
Yeah, see, I'm still stuck in my, baby boomer binary thinking. Oh, Stephanie says, what beverage are we pairing this with?
Why always for me?
And
Actually,
Kathy says salted chocolate is even better. I agree, Kathy. Salted caramels
there
for
you
me.
go. So yeah.
Coffee.
All right. Well, thank you for playing along with that one. That was like, are we still awake here? I would love to hear from folks, like, how often do you complete your data integrity checks? And maybe some of you are like, I complete them daily and weekly and monthly and quarterly. And that would be a correct answer as well. I would say pick the one that is the most frequent that happens. Ooh, okay, whoa, ad hoc. Why is ad hoc winning? I'm traumatized by this.
Actually, Stop Hell does good business with clients who go, I'm not doing it, you do it. The other person goes, I'm not doing it, get us a consultant.
Totally agreed,
For
Marianne.
those folks
And
who
then
have
we
been
call Greg.
ad hoc, contact Marianne after the session and she will do a done for you services on a schedule.
Oh yeah, it's terrible. It's like plumbing. It's work that's not really doesn't really change, but we're good at it. We're consistent at it, and we send you a bill.
For sure. So think about this from a performance review perspective as an employee or gaining constructive feedback from your manager. What happens if that is ad hoc? How do you feel about that? So that's like a rhetorical question to think of your head and think it, and then translate that into like, what does that mean in terms of your data? And again, the idea of like, can you trust the data? Can it be optimized? Is it truly optimized if you're only doing ad hoc data integrity checks? I'm a big proponent of data integrity fiestas, an hour a month with your snack of choice, getting everybody into a room, got some party music blaring, and then just go through, to Marianne, your point, like a standardized list of data integrity checks and run through them.
Sounds like a hackathon by Mark Zuckerberg.
Yeah, but I'm not doing anything Mark Zuckerberg's doing. Mine's more fun. So since most folks check ad hoc, are there 3 data points that you check on a regular basis? And the folks at Stopple Analytics don't need to give away their secret sauce of what they do on a regular basis as part of their done for you services, or they can.
Oh, Greg owns that service.
Yeah, I was about to say something that I decided better.
Alrighty, so one person noted gift coding is sort of checked regularly.
Yeah, that has to pass an audit. Your gifts have to pass an audit.
Yes,
Yep.
absolutely. One of the things I always check is addressee and salutation. Because I had again an example where I made an online donation to an organization and the title field was optional. So I didn't put anything in there because I'm not into titles. My next solicitation was to Dear Rejman because they didn't check the addressee because they automatically assumed title, last name for salutation. And with no title, the salutation came out a little wonky.
It was an organization that we gave $500 to, and then they wrote, because we're a corporate donor, the next email we got was Dear Null.
As equally bad.
Yes.
Maybe.
And I wrote back, boy, it must be terrible to have a database where you can't put the person's contact information in for your company stuff. And some guy wrote back, yeah, thanks for understanding. And then after that, I heard for dear, no. Then it was dear, comma. They haven't gotten a gift from us since.
Oh my gosh. Wow. All right. So there's some great ones here. Duplicate records, definitely. Deceased records, returned mail, definitely. Again, if you're mailing, having a correct address format, you know, with a zip code / postal code that aligns with the correct city, absolutely important. Prospect coding, for sure. I think that's really important as well. And prospect assignments. There's nothing more irritating to me when there's like a proposal on a record, but there's nobody that's assigned as the frontline fundraiser. Like, who's making the ask here? Some mysterious person. All righty, we will keep going in the interest of time. So this is where those juicy questions around data deletion came in. And this is to my point, and Marianne, you made this great point, data lifecycle feels like death. And that's not necessarily the case. So if you think about data as an employee, we know a couple of things, right? We know that when an employee isn't performing or they've, violated the code of conduct, they're terminated. We know that some employees leave voluntarily on their own. So in other words, the role no longer fits their aspirations or is no longer in alignment. We know that some employees stay until they retire. And so they're around for 20, 30 years. So how do we effectively offboard them folks, or in this case, offboard data, in that context of having a data retention policy, or this idea especially around some legislation, the right to be forgotten. And I think to Greg's point earlier, what happens when sometimes the coding is relevant, but maybe not relevant, or maybe has a very short time span, as a contract employee. And so my question to folks is, do you have a data retention policy? Uh-oh. Come on, yeses.
This is a really visual tool that you're using where the yes shrinks.
Yes. Oh dear. Full confession, in the organizations I worked for, we also we never had a formalized documented data retention policy. It was always on my to-do list. And I always felt like, it's really incredibly important to have it. And I spun around, and I think this is where other folks have been spinning as well, around this idea of, what do you delete? Do you delete it? When do you delete it? Do you save it somewhere? Is it archived? What happens? So that was my one question to folks, was what was their philosophy around data deletion? I know there are some folks in prospect development who have some very strong opinions. I have a strong opinion, but I'm curious to hear what others have to say.
So one of my current clients, I've discovered that by telling them they should really keep all their old ratings, I have to look at a clutter of ratings while I'm trying to figure out who the best prospects are. So the question is does a rating serve me when it's no longer the current rating, right?
I think that's a very hot question, hot topic. It was one of the ones I posted on the Prospect L, actually.
Oh, okay.
I'm a former historian. Nothing should be deleted. Ooh.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and
sorry
about
that.
Greg, you're a current historian. So like that begs the question, right? What would be our equivalent of a Wayback Machine?
But the question I would say is, do you need the Wayback Machine? Like, do you need it for everything?
There are some organizations that once a year they invite me to their events, and I write them back, this is my 12th time of asking you to take me off your list. They don't have a Wayback Machine, and they're not tracking that I've already said no 11 years in a row. That's a situation where I'd want to be. What is it? The right to be forgotten?
Yes. So here's my hot take on this, which maybe whoever is it Greg that's the former historian? I'm sorry, Greg. I do not believe that nothing can be deleted. I think if it's outdated, if it doesn't have meaning, if no one can explain its purpose or its use or why it's there or what it means, it adds no value. And in fact, to Marianne's point around the old ratings pieces, I think it can create confusion and create situations where you end up with a misstep in terms of a relationship with a donor, that it could conceivably do harm as opposed to doing help. So I'm actually pro deletion in those situations. That's my sassy take on that one.
But we're not binary. I mean, you reminded me not too long ago. It's not a binary question.
Correct. Absolutely. And this is why the importance to having that data retention policy, I think, is, again, the policy, to your point, Marianne, doesn't necessarily need to be binary. Like, we will keep this, we will not keep this. It can be, here is how we make decisions on whether we keep or delete information. Here are the questions we will ask ourselves.
Right.
It can be simple as that. As simple as that. All righty.
I see a lot of these answers as, if the data was wrong to begin with, it's worth deleting. I see a lot of that in the answers that you've got.
I think that's a good practice.
Yep. If I may stick one more thing in before you follow up.
Yeah.
In the chat, there's the link for our next water cooler chat. I hope you guys will all join us.